What lies west of the Sunset Sea? What secrets does the Empire of Yeti hold in the east? Could we hear more about Jon Snow in the north? There's no chance these Game of Thrones spin-offs could go south. In episode 1 of House of the Dragon, Alicent Hightower studies the history of Princess Nymeria with her companion Princess Rhaenyra Targaryen. Nymeria is considered such an incredible character, Arya Stark named her direwolf after her in the original Game of Thrones series, and HBO is already developing a series about her called 10,000 Ships.
She took Lord Mors Martell of Dorne to husband and burnt her own fleet off Sunspear to show her people that they were finished running.
The legend of Princess Nymeria begins about 1,000 years prior to the events in Game of Thrones. Prince Garin thought her people, known as the Rhoynar, could hold their own against the dragon-riding Valyrians. Nymeria suspected he was wrong, and when most of the men died fighting or were taken into slavery, she fled Essos with mostly women and children on the 10,000 ships they had left. After a few extended stopovers, Nymeria and the Rhoynar settled in Dorne, where she burned her enormous but barely seaworthy fleet to make the point that they'd found their new home. At the time, the Dornish were having their own Game of Thrones, and Nymeria married her preferred candidate for the crown, Mors Martell. She became the warrior queen, uniting the kingdom and ushering in Dorne's culture of independence and gender parity. It can be argued that a series about Nymeria would let audiences see one of George R.R. Martin's greatest heroines in a more nuanced light. Since she lived so long ago and what we know of her borders are myth, 10,000 Ships could be an ideal vehicle for even more spectacle, action, and romance than Thrones fans are used to. For example, besides that unimaginably huge fleet, the Rhoynar were defeated with an airborne assault of 300 dragons. Some storytelling formulas are tried and true, such as the trope of the reluctant adult forced to care for the precocious kid. Currently, you can argue that the biggest guardian-child duo is the Mandalorian and Grogu, while Game of Thrones has its own decidedly darker version with Arya and the Hound. But George R.R. Martin's novellas, collected as a Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, happen to contain an even better one. And it just so happens that a series based on the tales of Dunk and Egg is reportedly a high priority for HBO. Dunk is Sir Duncan the Tall, a poor squire from Flea Bottom who pulls himself up by his own bootstraps and white lies to become a great knight. Egg is an upper-class boy in disguise, who becomes his squire and traveling companion. Their adventures are episodic and genuinely more light-hearted than the other yarns Martin spins. But there's still an adequate amount of chivalry, backstabbing, warmongering, seafaring, and sexual tension to please the average Thrones viewer. A Dunk and Egg series would also give audiences the chance to see characters in their youth that they've already met. A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms begins roughly 90 years prior to Game of Thrones, and frequently ties back into existing lore. For instance, beloved character Sir Brienne of Tarth is related to Sir Duncan the Tall, though Martin has not yet revealed exactly how. But the Season 8 episode in which she's knighted is not so subtly titled, A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms. The most consequential event in George R.R. Martin's entire body of work could be Aegon Targaryen's conquest of Westeros. Aegon is such a pivotal character, the Game of Thrones timeline revolves around him. Dates are recorded as BC for before conquest and AC for after conquest. As entertaining as it is to watch his family line fight each other for the crown 100 years later in House of the Dragon, or fight for their very survival centuries later in Game of Thrones, we'd really like to see the military campaign that started it all. Aegon Targaryen I is probably the most cinematic personality Martin has yet invented. This striking, hulking, blonde-haired, purple-eyed man began his endeavor to unite the Seven Kingdoms, when, as we find out in House of the Dragon, he had a vision about a threat from the north.
Aegon foresaw the end of the world of men. It is to begin with a terrible winter.
Together with his sister wives, Visenya and Rhaenys, yes, he married both of his sisters and their dragons Balerion, Meraxes, and Vhagar, Aegon managed to incorporate 6 of Westeros' 7 kingdoms into his domain. Some willingly bent the knee, while others had to be convinced, though ultimately he was never able to subdue the Dornish. Though he looms large in the Game of Thrones universe, Aegon was a complicated person. There's enough material just in his tenuous relationship with the Faith of the Seven to make for a compelling TV series, let alone his wives, his 2 very different sons, the 6 kingdoms he ruled over, and the many battles which won him control. Alas, there's no Aegon the Conqueror show currently in the works. Arya Stark, played by the perfectly cast Maisie Williams, was one of the breakout characters of Game of Thrones, and one of the easiest to root for. When we leave her at the end of Season 8, she informs her siblings that she's not going back to Winterfell.
What's west of Westeros?
I don't know.
In Martin's novels, what's west of Westeros is the Sunset Sea, a body of water that is believed to be too vast to cross. So little has been written about what lies beyond the shores of the Westerlands that the showrunners, or even Martin himself, could have a blast dreaming up a new world for Arya and her shipmates to discover. Exactly what that world would look like Arya's voyage itself, could go in several different directions. Some characters hold that there are dangerous creatures, such as krakens or sea dragons in the Sunset Sea. If HBO wanted to lean into magical realism the way it has done with dragons, White Walkers, the Lord of Light, and the Faceless Men in Game of Thrones, an Arya Goes West series would certainly allow creatives to get fantastical. An explorer narrative could also riff on themes related to Europe's colonization of North and South America. But the main reason to make an Arya show is simple: more Arya. From her time as Tywin Lannister's cupbearer to her world-saving, dagger-wielding lunge at the Night King, Arya was consistently at the center of some of the series' most iconic scenes. Unfortunately, as of now, there's no Arya on the horizon. In House of the Dragon, Corlys Velaryon has several important posts. He's the husband of Rhaenys Targaryen, the one-time heir who was passed over with Viserys' branch of the family tree. He's the master of ships, charged with outfitting and commanding the royal fleet. He's also master of the formidable Driftmark stronghold, acts as a moderating voice on King Viserys' small council, and is the richest man in the world. Corlys will get up to his fair share of plotting and battling in House of the Dragon. But decades before that, he accumulated power and fortune as a young man, with unmatched talent on the high seas and in trade. Corlys' origin story will either be called the Sea Snake, a nickname that comes from the name of a ship he designed and built, or 9 Voyages, which were the number of journeys he took to far-off places like Pentos, Volantis, and the Golden Empire of Yiti. Regardless of its title, it'll illustrate the far-reaching adventures of this charismatic character before he was a fixture of King Viserys' court. In the novel Fire and Blood, Corlys is described as wise in peace, valiant in war, and someone who clings to life, like a drowning sailor clinging to the wreckage of a sunken ship. Though Steve Toussaint shines like sunlight on water as Corlys in House of the Dragon, a young actor would probably have to portray him in the spin-off. While the proposed 10,000 ship series focuses on a one-way journey, the Sea Snake would have a completely different flavor as an island-hopping, treasure-collecting romp. One of the places younger Corlys visits is Yiti, a thriving empire in the Far East. The Sea Snake managed to bring back silks and spices from the Golden Empire, making him twice as rich as he'd been before. Jorah Mormont also asked Daenerys to run away with him to Yiti after Khal Drogo's death in Game of Thrones. But outside of these few connections, Yiti has a rich culture and a dramatic history all its own, one worthy of its own TV show. HBO is in pre-production on an animated series that will aim to tell the stories of the Golden Empire, though no release date has been announced and no other relevant information has been revealed. While it'd be great to give Asian actors an opportunity to play live-action roles within the Game of Thrones universe, the colorful and diverse world of Yiti, which boasts lush farmland, basilisk-ridden jungles, and bustling urban centers, can be beautifully rendered in animation. With a history that stretches back thousands of years, occasionally intersecting with Valyria and its dragons, there's just as much drama between the various god emperors who aspire to the Yiti throne as any other royal family in Game of Thrones. A show that delves into Yiti, a subject which George R.R. Martin has written comparatively little about, could make for a refreshing change of scenery. As Game of Thrones drew to a close, HBO began mining Martin's novels for more content. The network reportedly met with potential writers to develop pitches and assured them that no concepts were too weird. In total, about 15 spin-off ideas were considered. One of the pitches that failed to get the green light was a superhero team-up story about Westerosi gods. While that may sound a bit too much like Eternals, Marvel's foray into ancient religions, a series that further explores the role of religion in the Seven Kingdoms could be interesting.
Does House Charlie keep the old gods?
No, my lord. I was named in the light of the Seven.
Characters in Game of Thrones often refer to their deities as the Old Gods and the New. The New refers to the Seven, also known as the Seven Gods, and the Seven-Faced God, who became the deities of the most widely practiced faith in Westeros. Followers pray to the Father, the Mother, the Maiden, the Crone, the Warrior, the Smith, and the Stranger, each representing a different aspect of humanity. For example, a soldier might pray to the warrior for bravery before an upcoming battle. This septad may or may not have been real people, but their origins are from about 6,000 years before the High Sparrow wreaks havoc in Season 5. As in life, religious factions vie for political power in Westeros, with just as much fervor as any of the noble families. A show about the Seven that flashed back and forth between the faith's foundings and its influence circa the original Game of Thrones timeline would likely be as dark, mysterious, and morally ambiguous as the rest of Martin's world. House of the Dragon is filling in the juicy backstory of one of Westeros' most notorious families, and so far audiences are happy to have all the salacious details. It stands to reason they'd be just as curious to know more about the other family at the center of Game of Thrones, and HBO may have planned to revisit the Kingdom of the North with a series called either Blood Moon or The Long Night, starring British actress Naomi Watts. It was to take place in the Age of Heroes thousands of years ago. They even spent $30 million on a pilot before unceremoniously canning the project. Though legions of Thrones fans would surely love to see the unaired episode, from context clues it sounds like it may have shifted its focus away from familiar faces and places. Perhaps the series that sat squarely on the shoulders of King Brandon Stark, the founder of Winterfell and House Stark, would have fared better. Part of the fun of a Bran the Builder story is that the man himself may never have existed, though there are myriad carvings depicting his great works, and his body supposedly lies in Winterfell's crypt. According to the companion book The World of Ice and Fire, Bran's legend may be the result of a millennia of exaggeration and conflation. Generations of Starks have been named after him, eventually culminating with King Bran the Broken at the end of Game of Thrones. We've seen the Seven Kingdoms in chaos and decline, and now we've seen them at one of their high points in House of the Dragon. It'd be fun to see them in the distant past, as one of the franchise's most familiar locales was in the process of being constructed. When Game of Thrones ended in 2019, most fans assumed that they were leaving behind the likes of Jon Snow and Sansa Stark for good. The news of spin-offs was already in the air, and all of them were prequels. That seemed to make sense, as George R.R. Martin has yet to complete his novel series, and Throne stars like Kit Harington were already moving on to other projects. So it took a moment for the idea to register when HBO announced that it intended to make a true sequel about Jon Snow's life after the deaths of the Night King and Daenerys Targaryen, with Harington reprising the role that made him a household name.
I don't expect we'll ever see each other again.
I wouldn't be so sure.
Unlike the rest of the shows in development, there's no source material upon which to base a Jon Snow sequel series. All the potential writers have to go on is that Jon exiled himself to the north after killing his aunt and former flame to prevent further atrocities. We can assume he's been living as a wildling again, maybe as their chosen leader. But even that is an open question. This much of a blank slate could be a good thing or a bad thing. But what's promising is that it could be a chance for viewers to catch up with their favorite Thrones characters. One could easily imagine Sansa, Arya, Samwell Tarly, and even Brienne popping up through cameos now and then. Even more tantalizing, it could elevate Christopher Hivue's character Tormund Giantsbane to co-star.